Back in the 1970s, psychologists at the University of Minnesota studied hundreds of families and found something striking. Kids who grew up hearing frequent yelling were 3 times more likely to avoid arguments as adults. Picture this. You're sitting at the dinner table. Everything seems normal, and suddenly the voices rise. Words fly like arrows. The air gets thick. You freeze, trying to disappear into the chair. Those moments weren't just uncomfortable, they quietly wired your brain about what conflict means. Now think about yourself for a second. How many times have you swallowed hurt feelings just to keep the peace? That's not a weakness, that's the echo of those childhood evenings when raised voices felt like the world was ending. John Bowlby, the father of attachment theory, once said, "A child who fears losing love will learn to hide his anger." In homes where arguments turned loud and ugly, kids quickly figured out that conflict equals danger to safety. You might have watched one parent go silent and cold for days after a fight, and somewhere deep inside you decided, better stay quiet than risk a rupture. That creates a lifelong avoidance pattern. You become the peacemaker, but tension builds inside. Studies show these kids often grow up with chronically elevated cortisol, the stress hormone that turns even a small disagreement into a survival-level threat in your body. Ever notice how right before a tough conversation, your throat tightens the same way it did when you were 8? Here's a hard neurofact. Children who regularly witnessed loud parental fights develop an overactive amygdala, the brain's fear center, which makes conflict feel disproportionately threatening for the rest of their life. When parents screamed, your young brain registered it as immediate danger. Maybe you hid under the blanket or escaped to your room to block out the noise. Over time, that became automatic. Any hint of disagreement flips the switch to survival mode. People with this background often end up with partners who also hate conflict, or conversely, with explosive ones, unconsciously recreating the familiar chaos. According to the American Psychological Association, adults from high-conflict homes are about 40% more likely to suffer from chronic anxiety. Does that ring true? Do you catch yourself mentally rehearsing every word before you dare disagree with someone? In the 1990s, Harvard researchers followed 200 adults and discovered that those who grew up in loud, argumentative households had, on average, 25% lower self-esteem, specifically in conflict situations. Yelling taught you that expressing a different opinion creates chaos. You probably noticed how, after a big fight, the whole house felt heavy for days. So you learned to stay silent to prevent things from getting worse. It gave the illusion of control. If I don't fight, everything stays calm. Reality check. Suppressed anger doesn't disappear. It turns into passive aggression. Interestingly, in therapy, these people often recall secretly wishing for a perfect family that never raised voices, and that fantasy still shapes what they expect and fear in relationships today. Think about it at work. How often do you nod along with your boss, even when you know they're wrong, just to avoid the tension? A 2015 study published in the Journal of Family Psychology showed that children from high-conflict homes are much more likely to develop an avoidant attachment style, which makes close relationships feel risky. Growing up around shouting, you learn to link love with silence. Fights might have ended in make-up moments, but the fear lingered. What if next time everything actually breaks? That plants the deep belief, conflict destroys connection. As an adult, this shows up as dodging real conversations. Fun fact, people with this history are more likely to use humor, sarcasm, or changing the subject to diffuse tension, anything except actually addressing the issue. Statistics show couples with this background often divorce, not because of explosive fights, but because of years of unexpressed resentment piling up.
Remember promising yourself as a kid, after yet another shouting match, "I will never let things get like this." Virginia Satir, one of the pioneers of family therapy, put it bluntly: "Families that yell teach children that emotions are weapons, not tools." In homes full of shouting, kids watch emotions spiral out of control and decide the safest choice is never to start. You might have even become the little mediator, trying to calm both parents down, which only strengthened your fear of your own anger. This pattern carries over. You avoid arguments, but relationships stay shallow. A large British longitudinal study found that roughly 60% of people with this childhood background struggle to voice their needs clearly, and that often leads to feeling lonely even when they're in a relationship. How many times have you canceled plans with a friend rather than sort out a small misunderstanding?
In 2020, Oxford researchers analyzed data from over 5,000 people and found a clear link. Childhood fear of conflict from loud family fights strongly correlates with higher burnout rates at work later in life. If yelling was normal growing up, you learned that arguments drain energy, so you default to agreeing. But the frustration builds underneath, turning into chronic stress. Interestingly, many of these people thrive in low-conflict fields like programming, research, or solo creative work, but struggle in collaborative teams where disagreement is inevitable. Therapists often note that the turning point comes when someone finally realizes those childhood shouting matches weren't normal, they were trauma responses. Your freeze-fawn reaction was protection, not character flaw. Ever catch yourself staying quiet in meetings even when you have a better idea? A recent large meta-analysis in Psychological Bulletin concluded that chronic conflict avoidance rooted in childhood trauma is associated with 15 to 20% lower life satisfaction across decades. You grew up in an atmosphere of loud fights, so you became an expert at keeping peace. But sometimes it's worth asking, what if disagreement isn't always destruction? In therapy rooms, people are learning to express anger in healthy ways, and their relationships actually come alive because of it. This isn't about forcing yourself to fight more tomorrow. It's about seeing the origin story clearly. Next time you feel that familiar knot in your stomach before a difficult talk, maybe remember those childhood evenings and choose one small, different response. Because silence isn't always golden. Sometimes it's just covering up cracks that keep getting wider.